You meet someone new and the conversation starts flowing. You're talking about something you actually know about, something that genuinely interests you, and for the first time in weeks you feel like yourself. You're sharing details, making connections, explaining the fascinating patterns you've noticed, and you can see it all so clearly in your mind. Then you notice her expression change, that subtle shift, the smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes anymore. The way she glances at her phone, the polite nod that says she stopped listening 3 minutes ago, and you realize, once again, you've done it. You've talked too much about the wrong thing. You've been too intense about something she considers trivial. You've failed another social test you didn't even know you were taking. Here's what nobody tells you about why neurodivergent men struggle so profoundly in the dating world. It's not about your interests. It's not about your intelligence. It's not even about your appearance or your career or any of the surface-level things people point to when they're trying to be helpful. The real issue runs so much deeper than that, and it's something that most people, including the women you're trying to connect with, don't consciously understand themselves. Your brain processes social information fundamentally differently, and in the dating world, where so much communication happens in subtext, implication, and unspoken rules, that difference becomes a barrier that feels impossible to cross. You're playing a game where everyone else got the rule book at birth, and you're out here trying to reverse engineer the rules by watching people play. But every time you think you've figured something out, you discover there's another layer of complexity you didn't even know existed. Think about what happens in those early dating conversations. A neurotypical person asks you what you do for fun, and they're expecting a brief, socially calibrated response that gives them a general sense of your personality and lifestyle. They want to know if you're outdoorsy or intellectual, social or introverted, adventurous or homey. It's a reconnaissance question designed to assess compatibility quickly. But when you hear that question, your brain does something completely different. You actually think about what you do for fun. You consider it genuinely. And if you're being honest, what you do for fun is dive deep into highly specific topics that fascinate you. Whether that's understanding how regional rail systems evolved in different countries, or figuring out the optimal strategy for a complex game, or learning everything there is to know about a particular historical period. So you start explaining, because the question invited explanation, and you're being authentic, which everyone claims they want, except they don't want that much authenticity. They want the performance of authenticity within very specific boundaries. The disconnect happens because your information processing style is fundamentally different. When you're interested in something, your brain wants to understand it completely. You notice patterns. You see connections. You gather information until you have a comprehensive mental model of how something works. This is actually a remarkable cognitive strength. This is the kind of thinking that leads to innovations and discoveries and deep expertise. But in social situations, especially romantic ones, this strength gets interpreted as a weakness. She thinks you're being self-absorbed. She thinks you can't read the room. She thinks you're not interested in her because you're not asking her questions at the right frequency or showing interest in the socially prescribed ways. And the devastating part is that you probably are interested in her. You're just showing it differently. You're trying to share something meaningful with her. You're trying to let her into your world, but she's experiencing it as a monologue, as dominance of conversational space, as a red flag. Let's talk about what happens with emotional expression, because this is where the gap between internal experience and external perception becomes almost cruel. You feel emotions deeply. Anyone who actually knows you understands this. You care intensely about the people in your life. You think about them constantly. You want to connect. But your face doesn't always show what you're feeling in the exact moment society expects it to show. Your voice might not have the modulation that signals enthusiasm or concern in the ways people are unconsciously trained to recognize. You might need a moment to process what someone said before you respond, and in that pause, she's already decided you're not interested, or you're being cold, or you're emotionally unavailable. The truth is, you're often feeling more than the people around you, processing it more thoroughly. But because your external expression doesn't match the neurotypical template, you get labeled as lacking empathy or emotional depth. Do you understand how backwards that is? You're being judged as emotionally deficient while you're actually drowning in emotion, trying desperately to process it in a way that makes sense to you. The masking that you've probably been doing since childhood becomes absolutely exhausting in dating contexts. You've learned to suppress your natural responses. You've trained yourself to make eye contact at the right intervals, even though it's uncomfortable. You've memorized scripts for small talk. You monitor your enthusiasm levels constantly, trying to match hers, trying not to be too much or too little. You're performing neurotypicality every single moment you're together, and it's draining you at a cellular level. And here's the cruelest part of this whole situation. Even when you do the masking successfully, even when you manage to pass as neurotypical through sheer force of will and learned behavior, you're creating a relationship based on a false version of yourself. She's falling for the performance, not the actual you. So you're trapped. If you're yourself, she loses interest because you're too different. If you mask successfully, you're exhausted and inauthentic, building a connection that can't possibly sustain itself long-term because you can't maintain that level of performance forever. You want to know what's really happening in her mind during those early dates? She's running constant social calculations that are largely unconscious. She's tracking conversational balance. She's noting whether you asked about her day in the right way. She's measuring the ratio of time spent on your topics versus her topics. She's assessing whether your humor lands at the right moments. She's checking if you noticed her new haircut or her subtle mood shift. These assessments are happening in real time, automatically, and they're based on neurotypical social patterns that probably feel as natural to her as breathing. She's not consciously thinking about most of this. She's just noticing that something feels off, that the interaction doesn't flow the way it does with other guys, that she's having to work harder to maintain the conversation. And because she doesn't understand neurodivergence, because she hasn't been educated about different cognitive processing styles, she interprets that difference as incompatibility or lack of chemistry or some fundamental problem with you as a person. The timing thing destroys so many potential connections before they even really start. You experience time differently. What feels like a reasonable amount of time to respond to her text is 3 hours because you wanted to think about what to say, and then you got absorbed in something else and time just vanished. But to her, 3 hours of silence is an eternity. It's a signal. It means you're not that interested. It means she's not a priority. Meanwhile, you're genuinely confused because 3 hours is nothing. You were planning to respond. You wanted to respond. But your brain doesn't maintain that constant awareness of time passing the way hers does. Or she mentions she has a work deadline coming up on Friday, and you don't follow up about it on Saturday because you're not tracking that information in the same automatic way. You care about her work stress. You want her deadline to go well. But you're not maintaining that running mental timeline of events in other people's lives that neurotypical people seem to do effortlessly. So she experiences this as you not caring, not paying attention, not being invested in her life. And you're blindsided by her frustration because you didn't even realize there was an expectation to remember and follow up on that specific detail at that specific time. Here's something that might be hard to hear, but you need to understand it. The way dating works in modern culture is almost perfectly designed to filter out neurodivergent men. Think about it. The entire early dating process is built around skills that are neurotypical strengths and neurodivergent challenges. Small talk, reading subtle social cues, projecting confidence through body language, maintaining the right level of interest without being too eager or too aloof, flirting, which is essentially playful communication based entirely on subtext and implication. Managing ambiguity because modern dating is deliberately ambiguous for weeks or months. Multitasking your attention between what she's saying, how she's saying it, her body language, the environment, your own presentation, and the timing of everything. These are the exact areas where your brain works differently. If someone sat down and designed a social situation specifically to disadvantage neurodivergent people, they would create something that looks exactly like contemporary dating culture. The rejection sensitivity piece makes all of this exponentially worse. Every time she goes quiet, every time she seems less enthusiastic, every time there's a slight change in her texting pattern, your brain interprets it as rejection. And given your history, given how many times you've experienced actual rejection, that interpretation isn't even irrational. You've been conditioned by experience to expect that people will lose interest, that you'll somehow mess it up, that she'll eventually see whatever it is about you that makes you different, and decide it's not worth dealing with. So you're hyper-vigilant. You're analyzing every interaction for signs of her pulling away. And that anxiety affects your behavior. You might text more to reassure yourself she's still interested, which comes across as needy. Or you might withdraw to protect yourself from potential rejection, which makes you seem distant or uninterested. Either way, your attempt to manage your rejection sensitivity creates exactly the problems you're trying to avoid. Let's talk about what happens when you actually do make it past the early dating stage, because that brings its own set of challenges. You might think that once she knows you better, once you've established a relationship, things will get easier. And in some ways they do. But in other ways, the challenges just shift. Because now you're not just managing first date conversations. You're navigating the complex social expectations of being someone's partner. You're expected to intuitively know what she needs emotionally at any given moment. You're supposed to remember important dates and details about her life without being reminded. You're meant to initiate romantic gestures spontaneously. You're supposed to pick up on hints about what she wants, rather than making her state things directly. And all of these expectations are based on the assumption that you process social and emotional information the same way she does. The executive function challenges that you deal with every day become relationship issues that she interprets as not caring enough. You fully intended to pick up dinner on the way home like you discussed this morning. You agreed to it. You wanted to do it. But then you got focused on finishing something at work, and by the time you remembered about dinner, you were already home. She's hurt. She's frustrated. She thinks you don't listen to her or you don't prioritize her needs. But the reality is, you were juggling 17 different cognitive tasks today, and your working memory didn't flag the dinner task at the right moment. Your brain doesn't maintain that constant running checklist of commitments and responsibilities the way neurotypical brains seem to. You're not choosing to forget. You're not being selfish. Your brain literally processes and stores task information differently. But try explaining that without sounding like you're making excuses. Try helping her understand that your brain's executive function system works differently without having her hear that as you saying you're incapable of caring about her needs. If this is resonating with you, if you're seeing your own experiences in what I'm describing here, hit that like button, because what I'm about to tell you next is something most people will never discuss honestly. Subscribe if you want more unfiltered truth about neurodivergent men's psychology and relationships, because we're going deeper into territory that makes people uncomfortable. The sensory processing differences create friction in ways that seem trivial to explain but are overwhelming to experience. The restaurant she chose is so loud that you can barely think. The noise isn't just annoying, it's physically painful. Your brain is processing every conversation around you, every clatter of dishes, every scrape of chairs on the floor, and you're trying to focus on what she's saying while also managing a sensory assault that's making your nervous system scream. You're not being difficult by asking to go somewhere quieter. You're not being antisocial. You're trying to manage an experience that's genuinely distressing. But she experiences your discomfort as you being picky or high maintenance, or not wanting to be there with her. Or she wants to cuddle while watching a movie, which sounds nice in theory, but the physical sensation of being touched while you're trying to focus on the screen is overwhelming. You're processing too much input. Your brain can't relax into the moment because it's managing multiple streams of sensory data that are all demanding attention. So you shift away slightly, trying to find a position that's less overwhelming. And she feels rejected. She thinks you don't want to be close to her. The explanation about sensory processing sounds like an excuse because she's never experienced what you're experiencing. Her nervous system doesn't work that way. There's a specific type of loneliness that comes from constantly being misunderstood in exactly the same ways by different people. You're not making random mistakes. You're not being unpredictable. You're being consistently yourself. But that self doesn't align with neurotypical expectations, so you keep encountering the same conflicts, the same complaints, the same moment when you see disappointment in her eyes and know you've somehow failed another test. It's the loneliness of having your genuine efforts interpreted as lack of effort. It's the isolation of caring deeply while being perceived as uncaring. It's the exhaustion of explaining yourself over and over, trying to help people understand that your brain works differently, only to watch them conclude that different means defective. The special interest situation becomes a particular point of tension. The things you're passionate about, the topics that make your brain come alive, often seem bizarre or excessive to her. She doesn't understand why you need to spend hours researching how a particular technology works, or why you care so much about the minutiae of some historical event, or why you've watched the same documentary series 5 times. To you, this isn't optional. This is how your brain finds peace. This is how you process the world. These deep dives into topics that fascinate you aren't a hobby you can just moderate or control. They're a fundamental part of how your mind works. But she sees it as obsession. She sees it as you choosing your interests over time with her. She sees it as immature or unbalanced or indicative of some deeper problem. And when you try to share your enthusiasm, when you want to tell her about the fascinating thing you just learned, she tolerates it at best. Most of the time, she's just waiting for you to finish so the conversation can move to something she considers more relevant or more normal. You know what makes this especially painful? You're probably incredible at remembering details about your interests. You can recall specific facts, dates, connections, patterns. Your memory for information that genuinely engages you is probably extraordinary. But you forget her friend's name, or you can't remember which coworker she was complaining about last week, or you lose track of the details of her family situation. This creates a perception that you have a selective memory, that you remember what matters to you and forget what matters to her. But that's not what's happening. Your brain encodes information differently. Things that have clear patterns, logical structure, or connect to your existing knowledge framework get stored efficiently. Social information, especially information about people you don't know well, or situations you're not directly part of, doesn't get processed and stored the same way. It's not a choice. It's not a reflection of what you value. It's a reflection of how your neurology handles different types of information. But try explaining that, without sounding like you're saying she's not important enough to remember. The relationship advice that people give you is useless, because it's all designed for neurotypical brains. Just be yourself. Just be confident. Just show her you care. Just pay attention to what she's saying. These instructions are meaningless when your version of being yourself makes people uncomfortable. When your confidence gets interpreted as arrogance or awkwardness depending on how you express it. When your ways of showing care don't match her template for what care looks like. When paying attention to what she's saying means something completely different in your cognitive system than it does in hers. The advice assumes a neurotypical baseline. It assumes you're working with the same social processing systems as everyone else and just need to apply the right techniques. But you're not working with the same systems. You're trying to translate between fundamentally different operating systems in real time, while also managing a relationship, and also dealing with your own needs, and also trying not to let your anxiety about messing it up become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Here's a truth that's hard to sit with. Many of the women you date will never understand you. Not because they're bad people, not because they don't care, but because understanding requires stepping outside of one's own neurological experience and imagining a fundamentally different way of processing reality. Most people can't do that. They can intellectually accept that people are different, but they can't really internalize what it means to experience the world through a differently wired nervous system. So they'll keep interpreting your behavior through a neurotypical lens. They'll keep assuming your intentions and experiences match what they would mean if she did those same things. And you'll keep being misunderstood in exactly the ways that hurt most, where your genuine care gets read as indifference, your need for processing time gets read as coldness, your sensory needs get read as rejection, your special interests get read as priorities that compete with her. The workplace stuff bleeds into your dating life in ways that compound everything. If you're struggling professionally because your neurodivergence makes certain work environments or expectations difficult, that affects your confidence, your financial stability, your availability, your stress levels. She might be understanding about work challenges, but she's also making calculations about long-term compatibility, about whether you can build a stable life together. And if your career path is non-traditional or unstable because you haven't found an environment that works with your neurology rather than against it, that becomes another factor working against you in her assessment. You're not just dealing with social challenges in the relationship itself. You're also dealing with the broader life implications of being neurodivergent in a world designed for neurotypical functioning. The constant code switching is destroying you. You have a different persona at work, a different version of yourself with friends, another carefully constructed version for dates, another for family. You're managing multiple masks simultaneously, and you've been doing it so long that you're not even entirely sure which one is actually you anymore. You know the authentic you is in there somewhere, but it's buried under layers of learned behavior and social compensation strategies. And the exhausting part is that none of these versions can be sustained indefinitely. Eventually, the mask slips. Eventually, she sees the real you, the you who needs to decompress alone after social situations, the you who gets overwhelmed by unexpected changes, the you who hyper-focuses and loses track of time, the you who processes emotions slowly and needs space to figure out what you're feeling. And when she sees that version, when the real you emerges, she often decides that the person she was dating initially was the real you. And this is you checking out, or losing interest, or revealing some hidden character flaw. Let's talk about the pattern you've probably noticed. The relationships that do develop often follow a similar trajectory. Things start well because you're masking effectively, and she's intrigued by your intelligence or your unique perspective or your intensity about things you care about. There's a honeymoon period where your differences seem charming or interesting rather than problematic. But over time, as intimacy increases and you can't maintain the mask as consistently, the friction starts. She begins mentioning little things that bother her. You're not as attentive as you used to be. You seem distracted. You don't initiate enough. You forget important details. These complaints start small, but they accumulate. You try to adjust, but adjustments require conscious effort, and conscious effort can't be maintained at that level forever. Eventually, you're exhausted from trying to be what she needs, and she's frustrated that you can't seem to sustain the behaviors that came so naturally in the beginning. Except they never came naturally. You were just burning through all your energy to create that impression. The advice to date neurodivergent women seems logical, until you realize that neurodivergent women have been socialized completely differently than you have. They've been taught to mask in different ways. Their neurodivergence often manifests differently due to a combination of neurology and gendered socialization. And frankly, many neurodivergent women have internalized the same neurotypical relationship expectations and will judge you by those standards just as harshly. Being neurodivergent doesn't automatically create understanding or compatibility. It can sometimes, but it's not a given. And depending on how each person's neurodivergence manifests, two neurodivergent people can be completely incompatible, triggering each other's sensitivities and struggling with completely different challenges that don't create understanding but rather different types of conflict. The late diagnosis realization, if that's your situation, adds another layer of complexity to all of this. You spent decades thinking you were just fundamentally flawed. You internalized all the criticism. You believed you were too much or not enough or somehow broken. And then you discover there's a neurological explanation for why you experience the world differently, and it's simultaneously liberating and devastating. Liberating because finally there's a framework for understanding your experiences. Devastating because you realize how much pain and confusion and self-hatred could have been avoided if you'd understood this earlier. And now you're trying to navigate dating with this new understanding, but you still have decades of learned behavior and internalized shame to unpack. You still have all those voices in your head telling you you're doing it wrong, even when you now understand that wrong just means different. The reality that nobody wants to say out loud is that the modern dating market is structurally biased against neurodivergent men. All the selection mechanisms, all the social rituals, all the unspoken rules favor neurotypical social processing. And because men are still expected to initiate, to lead, to pursue, you're put in a position where you have to perform exactly the social behaviors that are most challenging for you, repeatedly, while facing constant rejection that reinforces every insecurity and fear you have about being fundamentally unlikable. You're supposed to handle that rejection without developing bitterness or withdrawal, but you're human. The pattern of trying genuinely, being yourself, watching interest fade, and ending up alone again eventually takes a psychological toll that affects how you approach new opportunities. The paradox is that the traits that make you challenging in dating contexts often make you exceptional in other areas. Your ability to hyperfocus means you can develop deep expertise. Your pattern recognition means you see solutions others miss. Your attention to detail means you catch things that everyone else overlooks. Your intense interests mean you bring passion and knowledge to whatever captures your attention. Your direct communication style means you're honest in a world full of performance and pretense. Your emotional depth means you care profoundly about the people and causes that matter to you. These aren't flaws. These are strengths. But in the dating world, strengths and flaws get assigned based on neurotypical social norms, and anything that deviates from those norms gets categorized as a problem regardless of its value in other contexts. You've probably had the experience of women saying they want certain things, depth and authenticity, and intelligence and passion, but then being uncomfortable when you actually display those qualities in ways that don't fit their template. She says she wants deep conversations, but she means deep conversations about emotions and relationships, not deep dives into topics you're passionate about. She says she wants authenticity, but she means authenticity that's still socially calibrated, not the unfiltered version of you that doesn't monitor intensity levels. She says she wants someone who's passionate, but she means passionate about his career or his hobbies in a balanced way, not someone who disappears into special interests for hours at a time. The language suggests she wants what you are, but the reality is she wants a neurotypical version of those qualities. Drop a comment below if you've experienced this disconnect between what women say they want and how they actually respond to who you are. Because this next part is crucial to understand. The exhaustion you feel isn't just about dating. It's about constantly existing in a world that wasn't designed for your neurology. Every system, every social structure, every unspoken expectation assumes a neurotypical baseline. You're accommodating and adjusting and compensating constantly in every area of your life, and dating is just one more arena where you have to figure out rules that everyone else absorbed unconsciously while you're manually calculating every move. And the worst part is that your compensation strategies work well enough that people assume you're neurotypical and then judge you harshly when you can't maintain the performance consistently. You're too functional to get understanding, but too different to be accepted as is. The future you imagine, where someone truly gets you, where you can be yourself without constant monitoring and adjustment, where your differences are understood rather than tolerated, starts to seem impossible after enough failed attempts. You begin to wonder if you're asking for too much. You start to question whether you should just accept being alone, or whether you should force yourself to maintain the mask indefinitely with someone who loves the performance rather than the reality. Neither option feels viable. You don't want to be alone forever, but you also can't spend your entire life pretending to be someone else just to maintain a relationship. The energy required to sustain that level of masking in an intimate relationship would destroy you even more thoroughly than loneliness does. Here's what you need to understand about why women keep neurodivergent men single for so long. It's not that individual women are malicious or deliberately cruel. It's that the entire dating ecosystem is built on neurotypical social processing as the default, and anything that deviates from that default gets filtered out through 1,000 small moments of friction and misalignment. Your brain is running different software, and she's expecting specific responses and behaviors that would be natural outputs of neurotypical software. When your outputs don't match her expectations, she experiences that as something wrong with you, rather than as a difference in how your brain processes social information. And because neurodivergence in men is still poorly understood, because the stereotypes focus on extreme presentations rather than the full spectrum of how it manifests, she doesn't have a framework for understanding what she's experiencing. She just knows something feels off, something doesn't flow right, something requires more effort than her relationships with neurotypical men. The statistical reality is harsh. Neurodivergent men are significantly more likely to be single, to have fewer relationship experiences, to struggle with dating throughout their lives. This isn't because there's something fundamentally wrong with you. This isn't because you're unlovable or defective. This is because the skills required to successfully navigate modern dating are precisely the skills that neurodivergent brains find most challenging, and the traits that neurodivergent men often possess. The traits that could be tremendous strengths in relationships like loyalty and honesty and deep caring and consistent behavior get overlooked or undervalued because they're wrapped in a package that doesn't perform neurotypicality convincingly enough. You're not imagining how hard this is. You're not being oversensitive about the challenges. You're navigating a system that was designed without consideration for how your brain works, and you're doing it without clear guidance or support because society still treats neurodivergence as an individual problem to overcome, rather than a natural variation in human neurology that requires accommodations and understanding. The women who reject you aren't villains, but they're also participants in a system that filters you out, that treats your differences as deficits, that expects you to change how you fundamentally process reality rather than meeting you where you are. The path forward isn't about becoming more neurotypical. You can't. Your neurology is what it is. The path forward is about finding or creating spaces where your natural way of being is understood, where direct communication is valued, where your need for depth and pattern and structure is recognized as a feature rather than a flaw. That might mean seeking out partners who are educated about neurodivergence. That might mean being explicit about your neurological differences early on, so you're filtering for understanding, rather than trying to pass as neurotypical until the mask inevitably slips. That might mean building a life that's fulfilling enough that relationships become something you desire, rather than something you desperately need to feel complete. The loneliness is real. The frustration is valid. The pain of being constantly misunderstood is profound. But your neurodivergence is not a defect. The world's inability to accommodate and understand different neurologies is the actual problem. You are navigating a dating landscape that is structurally hostile to how your brain works, and the fact that you keep trying, that you keep putting yourself out there despite repeated rejection and misunderstanding, that takes courage that most people will never have to demonstrate. This isn't about fixing yourself. This is about surviving and eventually thriving in systems that weren't built for you, while holding on to the truth that your way of experiencing and processing reality is legitimate, even when the world keeps telling you it's not.